When your NBA team needs a shakeup, the easiest thing to do is to fire the head coach, and that's exactly what the Raptors did. But the reality is, there are many other problems going on in Toronto, and in this video we're going to discuss what the biggest problem was for the Raptors last season, because it wasn't Nick Nurse. Let's get into it. If you like the Raptors, you're going to love Amateur Hour Sports. It's a YouTube channel dedicated to Toronto Raptors content in videos, live streams, and shorts, and we're so close to the milestone of 14,000 subs that you can help us hit. Also want to thank the sponsor of today's video, the Queensway Automotive Group. Make sure to check the link in the description to learn more about their company. But we've had about a day now for the dust to settle on the Nick Nurse situation, as more reports are starting to come out about Nick Nurse, which I'm sure we'll cover in other videos on this channel. It's really settling in here that the head coach for 5 years from this team no longer is going to be with the organization. And even though I've seen a few people victory lapping this sort of situation, a lot of people really feel sad about this. This is likely the greatest head coach in the history of the franchise. He brought the franchise their first and only NBA championship, and he's really entrenched within the history of this organization until we get back to that pinnacle of the NBA championship. Championships, as much as people want to say they don't, championships do not just happen. It's so much work being put in by so many different people, including, of course, the head coach. So we have Nick Nurse to thank for that. People are sad, people are unhappy about the situation, but it's more so unhappiness that we got to this point with Nick Nurse, where we have the winningest coach in franchise history being kicked out after winning Coach of the Year, after winning an NBA championship. How did we get to this point with the team? Obviously, there were some shortcomings with Nick Nurse over the course of last season. His lack of adjustments was probably the biggest thing that plagued him. He really did not adjust to the evolving NBA, evolving to his schemes, evolving to his very aggressive defensive tactics, and the NBA evolving from an offensive standpoint, becoming a much more high-scoring league. It seemed like a lot of the NBA evolved without him. And also, there are suggestions now coming out just a day after Nurse being fired that there was a lot of backroom issues, a lot of things behind the scenes that were plaguing this Toronto Raptors team from a coaching staff standpoint. And that has really led to Masai Ujrii, Bobby Webster having decisions to make over the next week or so to see who amongst the coaching staff is going to remain here, like Trevor Gleeson, like Adrian Griffin, Earl Watson, among other people. But still, how did we get to this point with Nick Nurse as the head coach? Because a lot of people understand that Nick Nurse is still a great head coach, but perhaps he wasn't the right head coach for what the Raptors needed. So where did the problems come for the fact that we can't get the most out of this head coach and this head coach can't get the most out of this team? Well, the problems really start with the roster construction, and it was a problem from day one for this team. There was a significant lack of shot creation for this team. That's been a problem for a while now, but Nurse was able to hide a lot of the shortcomings last season, like not having a traditional center for like 2 straight seasons. We were able to mask that in many ways last season, not having enough ball handling shot creators on this team. Once again, we were able to mask that last season. One of the ways we would mask it is just getting all of those extra possessions, getting those turnovers, attacking the rim on offense, getting those offensive rebounds. That was a sustainable way of playing. And now we're seeing a lot of teams in this current NBA, even teams in the playoffs right now, who a lot of their offense relies on generating those extra possessions. Now, the issue is to exploit those extra possessions, you still need to be an efficient offense, which the Raptors were not this season. And to really, really exploit getting those extra possessions, particularly on the offensive glass, it helps to have some good shooters. JJ Redick on his podcast, The Old Man in the Three, has said that the best time to get an open three-pointer is directly off of an offensive rebound, because the shot goes up, the defense is worried about getting the rebound, the defense is worried about boxing out. They're not tracking you on the outside to hit those shots. But this season, we had our best 2 shooters regress in Fred VanVleet and Gary Trent Jr. from a shooting standpoint, and there was nobody here to help pick up the pieces for the team. Raptors fans, it was very clear for us to see in the previous offseason that this team did not have enough shooting. As much as we were happy with the 5th seed, 48 wins of last season, we knew we needed to build off that, and we knew we needed to further strengthen the team. The only thing the Raptors did to strengthen the team was sign pretty much Otto Porter Jr. and Juancho Hernangomez. Now, the Otto Porter Jr. situation kind of sad because he got injured. We never really got to see what sort of impact he could have with us. The Juancho Hernangomez signing, well, that was a disaster signing, and Juancho got waived most of the ways through the season. So there really was no strengthening of this team other than bringing us in a 33rd overall pick who, admittedly, played above his expectations, but still wasn't quite at the NBA level. Sure, he got a lot of game time near the end of the season, but Koloko really wasn't NBA ready. It was just out of necessity that we needed to actually play him. I have a lot of faith in Koloko's future, but just was not NBA ready for his rookie season, or at least shouldn't have been. It's just that, well, our bench was so depleted that we needed some additional help. So the biggest issue with this team, it was the roster. And it wasn't the trade at the trade deadline. Obviously, we're upset that that trade put us into a more mediocre situation. At least before the trade deadline, we were less than that, so we could still focus on prioritizing a draft pick. Once the trade deadline happened, we just committed to being a play-in tournament team, which is something I don't think really any Raptors fan wanted to be. But what it did do for our team in trading for Jakob Poeltl, it showcased that we have a damn good starting five. The starting five we had from the trade deadline onward was one of the top starting fives in the NBA. The issue was when you had to go to the bench. Now, you could say a problem is these guys are very tailor-made to play together. The starting five is very tailor-made to get the most out of each other and maybe not get the most out of the inferior players that are coming off the bench. That could definitely be an argument here, but ultimately, the bench didn't provide enough support consistently for this team. Now, you could say that part of that is on Nick Nurse. Part of that is on Nick Nurse for not getting the most out of these players from a developmental standpoint. And it's starting to become more apparent to myself that played a bigger role than I might suggest, but it did not play a bigger role than the fact that there were a lot of deficiencies with the players that were coming off of our bench. People have liked to say that the biggest problem with this team was the lack of shooting. People like to say that the biggest problem with this team was the lack of depth. Well, I want to lump those things together because they're the same thing. If we had more shooting on this team, we would naturally have those guys on the bench, or maybe they insert it into the starting lineup and somebody else is coming off of the bench. We would have a much more balanced team by having those shooters within our depth. And just by having those shooters in our depth, well, that improves the shooting. That improves the depth of this team. Because there were so many games this season where the Raptors, 35, 40 minutes of that game, they looked really good. They looked dominant. They looked like the better team. But maybe for the last quarter, they were chasing from a deficit. A deficit that was caused by an 8 to 12 minute stretch of the game where a lot of the bench was used. A lot of the bench players were used together. And it was so bad with those guys in the court that it was too much for the starters on this team to overcome. Now, I've talked a lot of positivity about the starting lineup. There's definitely some inefficiencies in the starting lineup as well. Some of those individual players need to step up. And maybe Nick Nurse didn't get the most out of those players in fourth quarter settings, but the bigger problem, the bigger issue at hand was certainly the lack of depth within this team, the lack of a bench, and the lack of shooting. All of those things coming together to say that the biggest problem was the roster construction with this team. I'm not sure how many coaches in the league could have gotten a playoff record out of the roster that we had this season, out of the individual performances that we had from players this season. Because OG Anunoby, we know he can be a premier player on a contending team as a 3-and-D threat. We've seen Fred VanVleet as an all-star. Pascal Siakam has made 2 All-NBA teams, 2 All-Star teams. Jakob Poeltl, according to Masai Ujrii, he's a top 10 center in the NBA, and the IQ that he brings to the team, that he brings to the game, that would be suitable for a championship contending team as well. So there's a lot of good players. Scotty Barnes won Rookie of the Year as well that make up our starting five here, but there wasn't really enough to supplement them. And that starting five isn't good enough to just carry the depth on their own. So there are a lot of deficiencies with the way Masai Ujrii built this team. And I will say from the press conference that Masai Ujrii had yesterday, he didn't exactly admit to his shortcomings from the season, but he did concede that there were areas where he definitely could have been better. I was pretty happy with how open Masai Ujrii was in answering the questions that were fielded to him yesterday over the course of like 45, 50 minutes in his press conference. He understands that more changes need to be done, and there's been reports coming out about the Raptors that more changes or big changes are going to be on the way. Well, we had a big change here. Our head coach is gone. Nick Nurse is gone. But more changes need to happen. If Masai Ujrii keeps the formula for the roster construction mostly the same, then it won't make a difference that Nick Nurse is gone. The next coach that will come in will likely have the same sort of issues in getting the most out of this roster as a whole. What made this Raptors team so special for most of the 2010s and what helped us build up all the way to an NBA championship in 2019 was the depth. Our identity was our strength in numbers and our defense for sure in the Nick Nurse era. But mostly in the Dwayne Casey era, transitioning to Nick Nurse, it was our strength in numbers. And we developed that strength in numbers by finding the diamond in the rough sort of players, finding the developmental pieces that maybe were overlooked by every other team in the NBA. We found something within them that other teams couldn't find, and maybe the player themselves, maybe they didn't know that they had that within themselves. Taking Pascal Siakam as an energy scorer off the bench and turning him into an all-NBA talent, like that was a pretty remarkable job that the Raptors have done with him, and that's just one of the many that they've done a great job with. But the talent certainly has dried up in terms of the scouting and in terms of the development in the last few years. I think a lot of that, most of that, is on the front office, the recruiting. Most of that is on them. But a big part as well has to be shared by Nick Nurse, who maybe didn't get the most out of these developmental players. Something that has really stuck with me that was brought up to me yesterday was Nick Nurse was brought to this team to win, to seal a deal, to win an NBA championship. And Nick Nurse is a winner. He's a coach who wants to win. But he's not a coach who understands the bigger picture in needing to develop these players. When the season wasn't really going well for the Raptors this season, when the season wasn't really going well, and they were on the outside of the play-in tournament picture looking in, maybe it was time for Nick Nurse to address the depth of this team, address the development of the team, and get more play time to these younger bench guys. But also, there was the weight of expectation on him for this season to make the playoffs, to get into the play-in tournament. And when the front office traded for Jakob Poeltl at the trade deadline, well, that made the message even more clear that we want to win games this season. So Nick Nurse was just putting teams out there desperately trying to win games. His focus wasn't on developing players, and maybe that's not his strong suit either. He has been here to win games. And when the winning dried up this season, it's become apparent that we need to get back to the era of development to get this organization back to the top of the NBA, where this team wants to be, where Masai Ujrii wants to be. And perhaps Nick Nurse, 41-41 record with a mediocre team, that's not enough to fire him. Maybe some comments in the press conference for the Philadelphia game, I would say maybe that is enough to fire him. But what also is part of the reasoning for firing him, there's a recognition that Nurse is a winning coach, but he's not a developmental coach. So it's time to find a new coach for this team that can help with the development process. Names coming out like Patrick Mutombo, who I name dropped in yesterday's video as well. That is what the shift in focus is going to be for this front office. But the fact that we've gotten to this point where we need to shift our focus from winning to developing, that's largely on the front office for the amount of talent coming to the team drying up. That's largely on the front office for not finding those players from a scouting perspective. It's also on the front office for trading away our treasured, cherished first-round picks. Masai Ujrii in yesterday's press conference to talk about we're a great drafting team. We can always find new talent. Well, you can't draft new talent if you don't have your draft picks. We didn't have our first last year. We don't have our second this year, and we don't have our first next year. So it's time to start using these draft picks and putting the talent back in this roster. Nurse, for what it's worth, had his deficiencies this season. But also, the biggest amount of blame goes in the front office for the roster construction and not putting the right team in place for Nick Nurse to work with. Nick Nurse is not exempt from criticism and shares the blame, but he was far from the biggest problem that plagued the Toronto Raptors in the 2022-2023 season. What do you guys make of this video? What do you think was the biggest problem with the Raptors last season? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below, because that is it for me for today. If you did enjoy this video, please make sure to drop a like and subscribe to MHR Sports for more Raptors content just like this.